This is the only unexplainable paranormal experience to ever happen to me, and I assure you, I haven't written a creative writing story since high school. I've tried to tell it exactly how it happened. I've always had trouble sleeping. Once I'm asleep and I don't wake up. In fact, I usually sleep in and miss half the day, but I have never gotten to sleep easily. A true night owl. It's not a fear thing or an anxiety thing. I just never get into the mindset to doze off. Even in bed, I can just spend all night watching videos on my phone or reading. Before that, it was playing on my Game Boy as a kid. As far back as I can remember, I would even just lie there looking at the ceiling, thinking about things. Wide awake as usual, checking the clock every now and then, getting more annoyed as more time passed. This is still very much the case. I'm a terrible sleeper with no reason to be, no fear of the dark, usually no anxieties keeping me up. I'm just a person who can never seem to get to sleep. So, this story takes place when I was 17. I was a student in high school doing only science as my elected subjects and didn't grow up religious. Just for some added background about the type of guy I was. A logical guy who valued facts, evidence, and shit. You know what I mean. I was lying in bed with my head propped up on two pillows watching YouTube videos on my phone. It was around 2:30 a.m., and it was completely normal for me to be awake watching YouTube videos at the time. I was usually falling asleep at 4 or 5 a.m. and waking up past midday, or even later. It was school holidays when the first incident happened, which is why I could get away with waking up so late and staying up all night. Anyway, I'm trying to say that despite the very late time of night, I was certainly wide awake, not even tired. And this was normal for me. My bed was just as much a place to chill and watch stuff for me than it was a place to sleep. So there I was watching YouTube videos on my phone at 2:30 in the morning, when suddenly I heard someone or something take a very deep breath in. The sound of it alone was so loud and sounded so close to me that I was startled immediately and clutched my phone to my chest so it stopped producing light and fumbled for the volume button to turn the video down before just hitting the power button on my phone. The video played for a second more and then finally fell silent. During this time, I was still hearing the deep breath in. Then there was a slight pause, and then, again, as loud as can be, a deep breath out. It was slightly raspy, almost like Darth Vader, but less robotic, not machine-like at all, and even slower breaths too, but similar in the way that you could hear the wind of every breath. The deep breaths continued, and I looked at my bedroom windows, and to the foot of my bed, my phone still clutched to my chest as I'm pretty much frozen in fear, simply due to how loud, slow, and deep these breaths were. Each breath in and out lasted 2 to 3 full seconds each, and were as loud as a breath could be without actually being vocalized. It was as if whatever was making the breathing sounds was going with every breath out, before making a small O with their mouth with every suck in. But not gasps or vocalized noises, just breaths. My mind was racing as to what sort of animal could make these sounds. But where I live, there are no big animals at all anyway, so I reasoned maybe the vents of the air conditioner or heaters or whatever were making some weird sound, but no. There's no small animal, or really any wild animal in the country, Australia, with the lung capacity to take breaths this deep. Certainly not in suburbia where I live. Definitely not inside my bedroom. The heating cooling still works fine and silently to this day, over 6 years later. And besides, there's no vents even close to my bed. All the while I was having these thoughts trying to justify the noise, I was still listening to the breaths. So I kept staring at the foot of my bed, where I thought the sound was coming from. But really, the only reason I thought the sound was coming from the foot of my bed was due to the fact that behind it was the only spot in the bedroom I couldn't see. So my brain just immediately imagined someone crouching there. This was just because the breathing was so loud and sounded so close that it still is, impossible to me that it wasn't coming from inside my room, from right next to me. I honestly think it sounded even closer to me than the foot of my bed. When trying to reenact it to tell my friends, and when I recount this story to people, I couldn't and still cannot make breaths as loud and as deep, and I'm an adult male. Only something with a huge lung capacity could possibly, maybe a huge man, I imagine maybe a giant football player, but that's it. When you try to draw out a breath for a long time, they get quieter. If you try to breathe loud, your breaths get shorter. These breaths were both loud and long, so I stayed there frozen, phone still clutched to my chest, staring towards the foot of my bed, then to the closed curtains, then back to the foot of my bed. For a few moments I thought, maybe, someone might be pressing their face against my bedroom window, behind the curtains, and breathing loudly to scare me. But I ruled it out, because it was simply too loud. The windows were shut and locked with curtains in front of them that would have muffled the sound far, far too much. This was like breathing in my ear. With each possibility I ruled out while trying to justify what was going on, I just got more fearful of the noise. So I just lay there in my empty bedroom, listening to these deep, ominous breaths, my eyes fixated on the foot of my bed, for realistically probably about 3 or 4 minutes, but it felt like 15, before it just stopped. The breathing didn't really fade away, it just kind of stopped as quickly as it came, maybe got a tiny bit quieter for a brief moment before the sound went away entirely, vanished with one last breath out, and I was alone again. I lay there for probably another 10 minutes without exaggeration, with my heart pounding in my ears before I calmed down enough to have the nerve to turn my phone screen back on. Even then, I just put it on my bedside table quietly and slowly, and then lay there all night. I know I sound like a pussy right now, because it's just breathing, but it was honestly just that much of a whack experience. And then it happened again. About 4 months later, at a similar time of night, maybe 3 a.m. again, it went on for about 4 minutes, slightly longer than the first time I believe. And I reacted in the exact same way. The deepest, loudest, breathiest breaths I've ever heard, sounding like it's coming from within my bedroom, like a huge man was standing right over me, right at the foot of my bed, or even closer right next to it. But of course, there was nothing and no one around. I've never been able to justify what happened at all. I know it seems like nothing because it's just breathing, but all these years later I got goosebumps typing this out. I also want to note that at the time I wasn't doing any drugs, and I've never been on any sort of medication. Since then, I've even had sleep paralysis and done psychedelics and recreational drugs a fair amount. I've done high doses of acid and smoked a lot of weed, and I've never had any sort of delusions or psychosis at all, ever. This certainly was not sleep paralysis either. I wasn't asleep, and there was no paralysis. Sure, I was frozen in fear as I felt vulnerable lying in bed in my underwear, but both times, I fumbled shutting my phone off, clutching it to my chest. Both times I was looking around my room, turning my head back and forth frantically. People who have experienced sleep paralysis know that you are truly paralyzed and can't move at all during the experience, and you wake up from it. I can remember everything before the events, during and after crystal clear. It never happened again after those 2 times, and it is the only thing in my entire life that I truly cannot justify or explain, and I feel like I've thought of everything. Some animal in the vents having its breathing echoed and amplified. Some weird problem with the vent itself. Someone outside my window trying to scare me. Someone outside my door. In my closet. All of these I've ruled out as impossible. I know I've said this a lot, but the breaths were just too loud and organic. Despite them being uniformly slow, deep breaths, there was definitely a slight human-sounding irregularity to them, in volume and in rhythm, which was just terrifying. The fraction of a second pause in between the breath in and out was the scariest part for some reason, lying there, anticipating the next breath. None of it makes sense. The only way I can describe it is it sounded like a giant man with an insane lung capacity, standing right over me, looking down at me, taking the deepest, slowest, loudest breaths that he could muster for 4 minutes before suddenly disappearing into nothing, and then I was alone in bed again, scared shitless. This may seem like not much, since it's just noise compared to other people's stories, but I assure you this story is true, and not exaggerated. I tried to describe it as accurately as possible. I've told this story a million times to people whenever paranormal stuff comes up in conversation, and it only makes it scarier to me that I've experienced sleep paralysis and drugs because it just makes me more certain that this was real life. I know it was, and it happened twice. Experienced as sober as a judge, wide awake and calm at the time, of course, before the breathing scared the shit out of me. This will sound trite and corny, but yes, I am still afraid to hear it again. And this will also sound corny, but I've been in real dangerous situations before and never even been half as scared as the pure dread and vulnerability I felt those 2 nights. For those few minutes, and for the rest of the night lying there after it ended. It was truly fucked up. I did not exaggerate or embellish any part of this story. Sorry if I repeat myself too much, but I felt like I needed to hammer home how visceral and intense this experience was. So if anyone has any similar experiences, I'd love to hear them. As I said, I'm non-religious, non-superstitious, and at the time it happened I was even less so, but I kind of believe this shit was a fucking ghoul. This happened years ago, when I was working as a laundry aide and housekeeper in a nursing home when I was 19. It still unnerves me when I think about it. So, like I said, I worked in a nursing home. This one in particular had a lot of sickly patients, either extremely dependent old folk or dementia, Alzheimer-ridden people. Each room had 2 beds, so they could have roomies or a couple could be together. If the family was really rich, they could have their own. Working there was unsettling enough, between hearing loud weeping and meeting residents who were like shells. It was an extremely sickly facility, and I knew it wasn't their fault, but being young, I was easily unnerved. There was one lady in particular, though, who always kind of scared me. I was 19, and this was my first job, so I was a very nervous person. She had a room to herself, with lots of things, but I never saw her have company. I tried to make small talk with her to be friendly the first few times I cleaned her room or delivered her clothes, but she always ignored me or glared at me. So I stopped trying. One day, I arrived to her room to clean and I hear her talking. Like full sentences, a full conversation, pauses and all. When I step in, she glances at me long enough for me to give a quick smile before she looks away again, staring at the ceiling. I looked around, but there was no guest. I shrug it off as a quirk and got to work. A few moments pass and I hear her talking again. I didn't understand her though, so I turned around politely and asked her, "Were you talking to me, miss?" She abruptly stopped and stared up at the ceiling, furious, and doesn't answer. I apologized softly and turned around to continue cleaning. Then she spoke again, and this time I understood her clearly. "Sorry about her. No, I don't want you to kill her." I froze and felt chills go down my back. Surely I misheard her. She continued on, saying, "Because if you do, the nurses will be upset, and everyone will make a big fuss, and I don't feel like dealing with that right now." I don't remember anything but fear. I finished as fast as I could and got the fuck out of there. I found my supervisor and recounted the story hysterically, on the verge of quitting. She didn't believe me, thinking I was trying to get out early, and told me to take a break early. I took the time to calm down, and from that day on, I didn't spend more than a couple minutes in her room when I had to clean it. Every time I did, though, she would be talking to someone I couldn't see, and I didn't dare interrupt her. When I was younger, I was always told ghosts and spirits weren't real. They were fictional and to not be scared. As a kid, I obviously believed they weren't real until weird things began happening. Things went missing. I saw odd things that just weren't right in mirrors and windows and so much more. The first time I saw the little girl was when I was 8. She was sitting at the end of my mother's bed just staring at me. I screamed and ran downstairs to go and get my mom, who was watching TV. When she came upstairs, the girl was gone. This is the start of all the things I experienced. It all goes downhill from here. After I saw the girl, the weird things became more frequent and intense. I would wake up with scratches all over my body. More important things would go missing all over the house. And I kept hearing footsteps. It felt like something was watching me and waiting. Like I was the prey and they were the predator. The second time I experienced something was when I was 9. I was sleeping and I woke up to what felt like hands grabbing my ankles. Before I could even act, I was ripped out of my bed. I started crying and screaming, and everyone in my house came running in to see what had happened. The way I was lying, I couldn't have fallen out of bed. I was dragged. This was not the little girl. There was something else in our house. After that stuff started appearing, I saw people in the corner of my room. Every time I woke up, I felt like something had been watching me. The next time I saw the little girl, she was sitting in the bathtub crying. I asked her if she was okay, and she ran off. This was the last time I saw her till 2021, which was my most recent sighting of her. I kept hearing footsteps back in August of 2021 from the attic, so I decided to go up there and have a look. My attic is too high to climb into and I don't have the strength, so I taped my phone to a thick stick so I could look at the footage once I got down. When I looked at the footage I saw in the corner of the attic, she was standing there, in the corner. She was only there for a brief moment and then she was gone from the recording, and that is the last time I saw her. That thing that dragged me out of the bed comes back though. I feel it every now and then pass through my bedroom. It's waiting and watching. I don't know what it wants, but it wants me. This event has stuck with me throughout my life. This happened when I was in middle school, and now being 23 years old, I still remember it vividly. I used to live in this house through 4th grade to my high school graduation. For most of my younger life living there, I had a loft bed in my room. I also was lucky enough to be given the room with the walk-in closet since I had more clothing than my sister. This closet had a light switch on the outside and a lock on the inside of the door. At some point, if I remember correctly, I even put a lock on the wall so I could lock it from the outside. I'm not sure why now. Either way, I was very strict about sleeping with it closed every night. One night I was sleeping on the loft bed and had been woken up on my back. I had always been a stomach sleeper, so this was already weird. I was compelled to sit up slightly and looked over the side of my bed to where the closet was. The door was wide open, with the light on, and the inside was completely empty of any of my belongings. The only sign there was ever clothing in there, was a few pieces of clothing left on the ground and a path away from the closet. Like when you do laundry and try to carry all your clothes, but a piece would fall out on your way. While staring at my open closet, a dark shadow developed on the carpeted floor below the threshold of the closet. From that shadow, a dark mass grew from the ground at a steady but slow pace. As it rose, it developed more features, grooves, and empty eye sockets, teeth, and a resemblance of a face. It rose until it stood just below the top of my closet door's height ended. It was a dark hooded figure with no body shape, its robe simply connected with the ground and melted back into its shadow. Under the hood was a protruding bleach-white deer skull with sharp teeth poking out in perfect symmetry. I stared at it blankly, feeling almost in a trance, unable to react or accurately process what was happening. After a few seconds of it existing in my space, it lifted its stare to face mine from on top of my loft bed. We held what eye contact we could with its empty black voids in place of eyes. Against my will, I slowly tilted my head down and nodded slowly to this figure. A second after my acknowledgement, it returned the nod and began to descend back into the shadow it had risen from. I watched as it slowly disappeared from existence until eventually the shadow didn't even exist anymore. Only then did I feel whatever force compelled me to sit up and move in the first place let go, and I fell backwards onto my back and instantly was asleep again. I woke up the next morning to find my room completely normal, closet closed, light off, and full of my usual possessions. Yet I remembered that night's events and the feeling of it vividly. I still can now. Since that night, I've never experienced that same scenario or anything similar to it. Now I'll admit some things about myself. I have never slept-walked in my life, not in my childhood, and not in my adulthood. The The most that happens is I talk and laugh in my sleep. I dream almost every night, and those dreams can be very vivid. I often wake up from them and have to take a second to realize I'm back in reality. However, I always know the difference between sleeping and being awake, and that night I swear I was awake. I felt myself move. I was sitting up and fell back on my bed. My eyes were open. I was being pulled by something and could feel it move me and release me. I try not to think about it too much.